Welcome everybody to the second edition of a webinar here with LeggUP. Today we have the pleasure of having Glenn Goss here with us, who's got 35 years of experience as a humanitarian leader and practitioner throughout Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. And today he's going to be talking to us a little bit about resilience, which is obviously a huge topic for all of us as we're out there. So Glenn, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you guys today from all over the world. And I'm here in southern France right now. The church bells are actually ringing. They ring for about 5 minutes, and people come out on the balcony and clap for the healthcare workers around the country here. And I know a lot of people that are tuning in today are, we're all experiencing the same crisis at the same time. It's a good time to talk about resilience. I want to talk more than just about the current moment, but also maybe some of your past experiences with resilience. And I thought I would start out with a picture of this tree from Vieques, Puerto Rico, a tree that was hit by a hurricane, one of the 2 hurricanes that hit in the last couple of years. Before I get started, I was just wondering if anybody, would like to give any input or sees anything that particular about this tree or.
And Glenn, that's a great point. I want to offer up to people so that they know, please ask your questions in the chat here. And as we get those, I'll collect them and we'll give the opportunity for Glenn to answer any and all of your questions. So look forward to seeing what you have for us.
While you make your comments, the tree is a great metaphor for a lot of things, rootedness, of course, and life, and also serious challenges like this tree is encountering. So I thought it was good to get started. Anyone so far?
No, we can continue on here, and people, now that they know they have the opportunity, will get our questions gathered.
Okay. It also reminds me, I started out in the field in the 90s. I was working in South Africa with a community development group, and we worked in South Africa during apartheid, and Mandela was elected president in '94. My son Max was born in that year. And we went for 10 years, did a lot of amazing medical and dental projects. I lived in the bush on top of my 4x4 truck for a couple of years, off and on. But after 10 years, the whole organization basically burned itself out. The organization doesn't even stand anymore today. I mean, somebody else is running the NGO. And it really started to teach me a lot about resilience. And so eventually in 2000, there were 2 cyclones that hit Mozambique really hard, one after the other. It was my first disaster experience that I got involved in, flying food out every day. And this tree really reminds me of, a lot of the things that I saw there. Of course, it reminds me of the people and the resilience and how hard they were hit, but also how they bounced back from this disaster. Would you like to just share, anyone, any input so far?
Yeah, if anybody has inputs or can kind of recall a time that they've experienced something like this, or any challenges or a great example, we'd love to hear those as comments or questions. Go ahead, Glenn. You can continue on.
Yes, and by September 11th, 2001, I was actually in Assisi, Italy, of all places, and saw the Twin Towers falling down. And it was a pivotal point in my life as well, because this was just after the cyclones. I was really healing from my burnout experience, even the disaster work, and then this thing happens, and it really pivoted my life. In literally the next 20 years, I spent studying resilience and really getting involved in conflict and disaster work, and trying to help other leaders and staff teams, even educators, healthcare workers, journalists, to build their own resilience and to also stay. I work in the humanitarian field, and one of the things that I'm really concerned about is that when people really love to do what they do, that they're able to stand in there and stay the course, and really, you know, recognize their true calling and get immersed in it, whatever that is. And so that's what I did over those years. Before I'm going to move on to the next slide, unless there's any particular feedback so far.
Great, please continue. And we also have Petra who is joining us, or Petra who is joining us. Petra is heads of all of our coaches here at LeggUP. So Petra, if you could take a quick moment and just introduce yourself.
Yes, hello everybody. Very happy to be here with you. I had some technical glitch to jump on the webinar and apologize for catching you guys right here in the beginning. Very happy to have Glenn here, and excited to hear his expert advice and insight on this topic today. And with that, I just hand it over back to you, Glenn. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Good to see you, Petra. Let's just talk about the definition of resilience. A lot of it has to do with adapting successfully. And, you know, when you see these kind of definitions, a lot of it has to do with bouncing back, the idea of a spring that, you know, is pulled to its furthest extent and then comes back. But as I was studying trauma and I was studying resilience over the years, and I've been working with the Harvard Refugee Trauma Program and the Global Mental Health Unit. And a couple of years ago, we were in Italy sitting around a bunch of humanitarian workers, healthcare administrators of large systems, professors, researchers, and we all sort of realized a lot of us we're in the same boat. Here we are doing this, I feel it's wonderful work, really helping people around the world, especially refugees who are in mid-flight or in conflict zones or in disaster areas. And we were thinking about our own, you know, how well we're bouncing back and how our organizations also are. There's also the idea of organizational resilience, and the entire organization being able to withstand huge challenges like this present crisis and others, and being able to not only bounce back, but bounce forward. So one of the other things that we talk about in that group is the idea, many of you have heard the term post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, that is a very real thing. There's something else called post-traumatic growth. And that's the idea that after trauma, after a hard crisis, there is certainly the potential for debilitation, but there's also this wonderful idea that after trauma, there can be incredible growth, knowledge, learning, the ability to pass this on to the next generation. And that's, I think it helped me to sort of reframe my thinking about resilience.
Glenn, I have a question from the audience here that ties right to this. And our member asked, in your experience, what is the best predictor of how well individuals or communities recover from challenges faced?
I don't know what the best predictor, but I think I do know. The best predictor is time. Because, you know, when I'm talking to somebody, you know, I've been involved with teams where one of the team members was kidnapped and held hostage, where there's been suicide bomb attacks with a whole group of people in a church, in mosques, in different places, and you know, communities of faith, which is a lot of where my doctoral research went toward that. And I, you know, I sometimes I talk to people literally after the bomb hits or the person was kidnapped, or maybe another trauma, and their way of sharing about resilience or about, well, actually, they're probably in shock in the first, you know, couple of weeks and months and not able to tell me, or they're quite angry at the situation or frustrated or unable to move forward. Then I come back a year later, 2 years later, sometimes 5 years or 10 years later, and I talk to the same people, and they have a completely different view, a completely different perspective on that incredibly difficult trauma that they never thought they would actually live through. So I think time is probably the best predictive factor for me.
Great, thank you.
Let's move on to the next one. Something else that came up in the research in the last couple of years with Heifetz and the Harvard Business Review, and especially when you're talking about organizational resilience, and even, for example, the air crashes, the Air France Flight 447 that crashed because there was information going into the computer from the pitot tubes that were on the outside of the plane that were frozen up, and it was giving the pilot and co-pilot a different scenario. In this case, the pilot was actually sleeping at the time, came into the cockpit, and sometimes the new normal of a crisis is like, it's immediate. I mean, you're thinking about the Boeing crashes recently, or other types of things. I spoke to a father of a daughter who was in the Lockerbie flight that exploded over Scotland. And he said to me, Glenn, he said, sometimes you receive a crisis, and other times a crisis is thrust upon you. And, of course, he went to the court in The Hague for several years after, and that was just after that was the time that I spoke to him. So his new normal was immediate, and he felt thrust upon him, but he did a lot of transformative things with that, and that's why I was talking to him about it and interviewing him. Other things, this present crisis are actually, I mean, literally a couple of weeks ago, we were looking at a very different animal than what we're looking at right now. Other traumas and crises like abuses in childhood and other types of oppression, people feel oppression in different countries or because of their gender, ethnicity, race, religion. And so that can be, that new normal is probably gradual. Sometimes it's been for years that way, but now it's changing in a new direction of persecution or types of trauma that we find when we interview people and counsel them. So the idea here is adapting to the new normal and figuring out what it is. I think we're sort of figuring that out now with the present crisis. We haven't established really what that is yet. We have some really good pieces of that, and we're putting it together, or the experts are. The other part of it is continuous change. So like with oppression, like with new types of challenges that come up in our society. Someone wrote in the Chronicle of Higher Education this week about the coronavirus issue. They said that asked her, this professor, when will the crisis be over? And she said, well, I think it'll never be over, because I think for generations to come, we'll be talking about literally what transpired in the last couple of weeks. So it's really that idea of how do you handle also continuous change and adapt continuously to, and even when your resources are low and you're feeling like you really don't feel like you can move forward, that's difficult. And that's probably the most difficult for people. I find that when people go through one particular, like a car accident, or they've been through a real health problem and they've come out the other side, they have a lot of time for reflection, a lot of time for, meditation and contemplation and looking back and moving forward and picking up where they've, building new resiliencies into their life so that they can move forward. And that's easier to do when it's multiple events that happen, or one that goes for a long period of time. It's more difficult. You can interrupt me anytime if someone has some.
Yeah, we posed the question to everyone, what things have you done to help you through your past experiences? And a couple of good ones came through.
Okay.
This member mentioned recognize what I can control and have a future focused mindset, which I thought was a great comment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll talk about that right now. Was there another one?
Yeah, the other comment was talking with friends, really engaging with your community to help you through it.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll talk about that as well. What I want to show you now, I have a lot of really excellent mentors. Dr. Tim Friesen in Grand Rapids, Dr. Sam Thielman, he was a former director of mental health for the State Department, and he trained ambassadors and diplomatic staff all over the world. And I had an opportunity to sit with him in his Washington, D.C. office just before he retired. Well, he still mentors me now, but I sat with him and I said, Dr. Thielman, you've been a psychiatrist, senior staff in the diplomatic corps for over 40 years. What's some of the cutting edge best research that's coming out on resilience? And he gave me this Southwick and Charney book, and these 10 aspects of resilience that came from, they interviewed Vietnam prisoners of war, those who had survived different traumatic events from childhood, and it was special forces soldiers and leaders in the special forces. And they came up with these 10 different aspects of the resilient mindset. The first one is, these incredible role models. It could be a role model that's in the crisis. You think of some role models that you've seen on the television, or you've seen that have spoken to you in your community about how to handle things right now, or you think of teachers from childhood or others who helped you along the way. The other one is cognitive flexibility. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's the ability to have an open mindset, and I think has a lot to do with the things that you can control. Your mind thinks of those kind of things that okay, this is what I can control and this is what I can't. So I can either release that, or I can get involved with it if something comes up that, again, I can control it, then I can get involved with that. It also has to do with the ability to shift thinking. You think of those Air France pilots, or you think of other people who, especially special forces soldiers, that hit the ground running, and they have to constantly change their paradigm and their framework and their way of thinking. And that also goes with the active problem solving. Realistic optimism, I'm going to speak about in a minute. It's vitally important. Social support was just mentioned, that friend kind of support, but it could be reaching out. The Vietnam War prisoners of war, you've heard these stories, where they had a code where they knocked on the prison wall and they could send code back to each other, or sometimes they couldn't see each other, but just in passing, and they had some way of communicating. They also had this kind of inner moral compass, this way of just sensing that maybe there's other people that are in need in their situation, in their crisis, or they're just tuned into some type of compassion, kindness, goodness, ability to see positively, to help other people, to gain encouragement and support. And many who were in those camps had a religious type of background, or some kind of spiritual type of routine that they went through, or rituals that were a part of their normal way of doing things. And all the major world religions, and even people that don't have a specific religion, have these kind of ways of tuning into, whether it's scripture or whether it's some kind of mantra or something that they can go back to, that really gives them, it actually, they've had studies that say that prayer and meditation can actually lower blood pressure, this type of thing. The other one was training and learning. I just heard a policeman that in New York City that retired, that came back to work today, and they interviewed him on the, maybe you saw this on the news, and whenever they interview a first responder or somebody who's in charge of a crisis response for a state or for a nation, I always like to hear the words when the interviewer asked, well, how are you going to handle this crisis? I always like to hear the words, we have trained for this over and over and over. That just helps me just to feel more at ease and, you know, like they've got this, you know, of course they're still putting it together, but I have this sense that people really are on the top of their game, and the training is now paying off. The other part of that is the learning. And they found that, you know, those that could actually learn from, like the special forces soldiers, they asked them, why do you do this kind of thing where you go underwater and you practically drown yourself, and there's, you know, jump out of airplanes and all of these things. And they said, well, you know, we know it's going to be hard, and we know we probably will fail the first test, but we know that the learning that comes out of it is incredibly important. That everything that we learn from this, we will use, and it'll probably save our life. The next one is meaning in adversity. And if you've, you know, heard of Viktor Frankl, as a psychiatrist in Auschwitz and a survivor in, you know, man's search for meaning. The idea, and this is where timing comes in, because usually when you're in a crisis, and you're really under pressure, in shock, meaning doesn't come right away. It's usually a few months after, a few years after, as your brain starts to rest and as you're able to piece everything together, then you start to think, okay, now I can understand why that some good things actually came out of a very horrible experience, and I can gain some type of meaning behind it that perhaps I couldn't while I was going through it. The last one is responsibility, and it's that idea that those that were in the camps that took responsibility for their exercise, their, you know, trying to spend the time in a good way during the day, trying to be positive, or doing religious type of coping exercises, but they practiced them every day. Those people really made it through. And it's the idea of leading yourself first and then others. So it's sort of taking that responsibility to lead yourself in all of these resilient mindset ways, and then you can lead others. Let me just talk about the realistic optimism part just for a minute. And there is this idea of the Stockdale Paradox. If you've read Good to Great by James Collins, they asked, and he was in the prison camps for about 7 years, and he was a top-ranking naval officer. And they asked him, who didn't make it through? Or, you know, what was the most difficult group that you saw there? And he said, well, the ones that didn't make it through were the optimists. And that's kind of a paradox, because of course optimism and hope is, you know, I've put it here on the slide. It's absolutely essential. Everyone watching this webinar knows that. But you know, it's this idea of ruthless honesty, situational awareness, being really honest with the crisis that's around you and actually what's happening. If you've read Good to Great, and if you're a business leader or you're an NGO type of educational leader, you may have applied the idea of, you know, looking at the brutal facts and, you know, the hedgehog and, you know, all of those kind of things. Just the idea that we have to confront it. We have to be realistic and temper our optimism with realism. Then at the bottom there, I wrote, you know, it's not just being ruthless about it. It's also, at the same time, it's being, you know, showing empathy, showing compassion. One of the things that happens when we're in shock or we're in a crisis state is we go into this fight, flight, freeze type of response. My response is usually to freeze first. And then once I come out of my frozen state, I start to, you know, okay, now what can I do? Other people, you know, they fight. And when you fight or flee, it's very difficult to be compassionate, to be kind, to show empathy. It almost fights against that, because your fight for survival doesn't allow for those things. And so having some of that training as well is really important. And that Stockdale Paradox is just rings in my mind all the time, just to keep optimism in a realistic type of way.
Glenn, on that previous slide there, and you can stay right where you're at, but on that previous slide there, we posed the question to everyone, anything you would add here that has personally been helpful.
Right.
One person reached out and said, focusing on something outside of myself, some tiny good that can make a difference to someone else.
Absolutely. That's really what it's all about. And it does take some sort of, because, while you're in that phase, that crisis moment, your blood vessels constrict, your breathing gets shallow and you faster, your neural pathways are constrictive. There's even a part of the brain that starts to shut down that works, does, planning and logic and those kind of things that you really need. Compassion being one of those things, and also reaching outside of yourself. It's not necessarily the first response that you have. And so I think this slide really speaks to that, actually, because we have to develop new ways, not just new ways of doing, but new ways of being. The idea of accepting, somebody said, those things that I can control, and accepting there's certain things that I just can't, and I don't need to at this point. Having an attitude of gratitude, but really being able to also know that when I'm in a crisis, or I'm the one leading or managing a crisis or managing my team, I need to take care of myself, because there's this idea of secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. The trauma didn't happen maybe to us directly, but we're hearing the news, we're hearing all of the stories, and that's affecting me. Or it did affect me directly, and that's primary and secondary. So even more, we need to slow things down. We need to take time to do yoga, breathing, guided meditation, whatever you do, to really train yourself and help your brain to slow down so that it can open up new neural pathways, and you can be more present with people. You can have a calmer, more resilient attitude toward whatever you have in front of you. I do now yoga every day, every morning. I wasn't doing it for a long time. It took a couple of years actually to work it into my schedule, that to really to work it into my life, where without it, I just haven't really opened up that breathing. I haven't really given my brain and body a time to just to slow down and just to tune in. I'm, like all of you probably listening to this, if you're listening to this, it's probably because you are involved in some pretty big things in society, and your list is a mile long, and it probably is a mile and a half long right now. I mean, I'm in France, in southern France, and I have all of my things packed, ready to move to New Mexico, but I have no idea when I'm going to do that. I have to slow things down every morning and then just focus on life. And of course, we're standing in line in the stores and that kind of thing. And yeah, I mean, like many of you around the world are doing. And so it's that ability to just also to manage your personal energy. Someone said, don't manage your stress, manage your energy. Your energy levels can go up and down. It can really be difficult to, especially because some of us have to spring into action. It's part, as a medical worker, as an educator, as a parent, we have to spring into action as a doctor. And so when you've expended a lot of energy in a particular direction, realize that you probably need to have some downtime, some way of regrouping again so that you can balance the energy. I used to talk about work-life balance, but I've heard more about work-life integration, just integrating the energy flow and being, of course, staying positive with that energy flow too is helpful. And mindfulness has been researched to have wonderful ways of just being able to be present, to be able to see the smaller things around you that you may have missed. Also to be able to control your breathing. One of the things that I tell the, first responders and other people is, just breathe out for 3 seconds, breathe in, hold it for 3 seconds. If you can breathe out for 6 seconds, that's even better. But just take sometimes I have to catch myself during the day I feel that tension in my neck. I feel the tension maybe in my sinus area because I'm prone to sinus, or wherever. It's different for everyone. And that's also what I wanted to mention, or it was another question here, is because this is a very short list of ways of self-care or taking care of yourself. There's probably some that have some ideas here as well that you'd like to add here. Any input yet?
A couple people have commented here, same thing with yoga, how that's helped them as well. So connecting the physical body with the mind like they have, I think that's extremely valid. And it sounds like a lot of people are doing that. Another person just commented practicing mindfulness. Another person just commented walking outside, just getting outside and connected with nature.
Very much, yeah, very important. Now, there's that connection with nature that sort of resets things as well. That's incredibly important if you know, when we can do that. Of course, we're, you know, a lot of us under restrictions right now, but, you know, even here in France, it's one of the 5 boxes that I can tick off. I have to have a note that I bring around to the police if they ask me for it. They asked me this morning to see, and exercise is one of them. So I think the health department added that to the note. But definitely, and yoga, you know, I used to do training in Iraq and Syria before the war, actually, with Iraqis that were going to Damascus because that was the safe place, actually, before the war, believe it or not. But in Iraq, there were a lot of IDP camps, internally displaced camps and refugees. And I did a lot of training there, and then I did a lot of training online. And one of the things that I recommended when I was doing the online training was to tune in to a young lady in Texas that was, I love the yoga that she does. I asked her, it was called Yoga with Adrian. Many of you probably do this already. You know, we had all of these Iraqi refugee workers who were doing yoga with Adrian and tuning in on the online every day. And it was great because it just gave them an opportunity to just, you know, to prepare for the day. And they had, you know, incredible work to do every day.
And somebody just commented that they did that exact same thing. So I think that's really cool.
It's very popular right now.
Yeah. Another person commented creating boundaries. Can you comment on how creating boundaries can help build resilience?
Yeah, I actually had that on the slide originally, but I didn't want to put too much. Boundaries are incredibly important, especially in a crisis. One of the things I do is training for first responders and second responders and you know, those that even respond to social media posts for counseling online and that kind of thing. One of the things that I tell people is before you get into this, or before you're responding, decide as a team, what is your role? What are you there to do? What are the things that you can do for somebody, and what are the things that you cannot do? What are the limits to your response? Know that ahead of time when people say to you, well, can you do this? And know also the resources in your community where you can refer people, you know, where you can't respond to them. So, you know, whether you're a teacher and or a medical worker and need to put up boundaries, and I really take my hat off to the medical workers, you know, listening to their stories of you know, multiple shifts in a row and all that they're doing. But there is, you know, all of us have a breaking point. And so we do need to establish what that is. And that is another key to resilience, is that what would, you know, absolutely put me under the table, for Petra, it might absolutely fine for her. She can handle it and she's very resilient in that area. But for me, I can't handle that. I'm not quite there. And so it's helpful to know, even, you know, we have, some of us have supervisors or line managers that are just, you know, like Superman, Superwoman. They do, you know, all these things. And we have to realize that sometimes we don't have that energy level. We have a different energy level, which is okay. It's okay to be at a different point. I mean, sometimes it's hard to keep up. You know, sometimes it's hard to keep up with these refugee teams that I work with. They do amazing things, but I have to realize that Glenn has a, you know, he has a level to which that that can't cross. So whether it's personal or whether it's talking with your team about, what kind of boundaries you need to set up, that's, yes, perfect question. Let's go to the last slide, unless there's something else.
Oh, please continue.
So how do we help others to build resilience? And you could probably put in here how, this is also a continuation of how we can help ourselves as well. But a lot of us probably listening today, and of course LeggUP is involved in coaching, and one of the things that we do in coaching is, we really try to help people to understand the situation that they're in the present and help them to move forward with whatever it is that the coachee brings to us. And one of the things that happens is, usually there are, they bring up roadblocks or obstacles, challenges, difficulties, reasons why they weren't able to accomplish what they wanted to set out to do. And that's why they're coming to you as a coach. And as a resilience coach, it could be, well, I set out in this direction, but this happened, this crisis happened, and I just don't have the energy that I once had, and I'm really trying to rebuild and get back to the point of, top resilience and, really flowing in the work that I would feel called to do. Because a lot of you who are listening, you're not just involved in a job, it's really a calling. I mean, the people that I meet, it's just, there's something in you that's driving you forward. That's why you're listening today. And so that's what we try to really go back in coaching and really try to bring that out by asking powerful questions and trying to get underneath, the crisis, and what were the things, how are you feeling? What is at the core of your being that this crisis has showed you something about? And again, a lot of that has to do with timing. A lot of it has to do with if that person is ready to do coaching, or maybe just listening, or maybe you're just an informal friend type of relationship. Sometimes we have to wait a little bit until people open up and are ready for this kind of thing. But if they are, one of the things my wife tells me often is just to be present, and the reason is because she knows when I'm not present. She knows when I'm just not a multitasker like she is. So she knows when I'm not present, she kind of point that out, but it's something that I've had to practice. It comes natural for some people. I have to practice all the time. That's why I do mindfulness, just simply to be present in the room, that when I'm then coaching or I'm counseling, I'm with that person and I'm not somewhere else. And also, helping people to see things in a different light, a different perspective. Crisis for me is, I think a lot of you have heard that the Chinese characters that make up the word crisis are danger and opportunity. So there's always this different lens, this different way of seeing the thing that you're going through right now, or the thing you went through 20 years ago that you're still processing. And I think we need to recognize that as well, is that people might be going through this current crisis right now, but so many people are still processing things that happened to them 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. When I'm talking to Iraqis, I ask them, what was the most difficult for you? The Iran-Iraq war, the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, ISIS, or one of the recent issues? And they all tell me the Iran-Iraq war was the most difficult for them if they're my age or older. But then they start processing things that happened so long ago, and it helps them to understand where they are in the current crisis and how they can move through it. Again, it's helping people to find meaning, but to make these kind of connections in the brain. This is something that crisis does. It helps us, there's a part of our brain that helps us to, well, I wouldn't say that we forget certain things, but we tune out of certain things that happened in a crisis, and we just don't connect with them because it's just overload. There's so much overload with the trauma or the crisis that happened to us. And we might not be able to have the events of the crisis in order. We might not be able to make sense of it or make connections with things. But then we find in time, and in time being that predictor of resilience. I think, you know, things start to open up and you can start to talk to a coach or someone else about, okay, now I'm starting to make connections between these things that I wasn't able to before. Another one is, you know, I think as coaches, especially if we are working with the International Coaching Federation or other groups, we're very action oriented because, and I like that idea to balance contemplation and meditation and mindfulness and prayer with action. So there's a time for this being present, slowing down, you know, self-care milieu that you might be involved in, but then there's a time for action again. So part of the action might be better self-care. So that's okay. But, and that's needed, that's essential. But it might be action for moving forward that now, because I've talked to somebody, you know, we found some kind of meaning, I've, you know, sort of helped to unpack this whole experience and put it back together again. Now I really can see, and some people do that through journaling. Some people do it again through spiritual, religious type of experiences or programs. Others do it verbally. You know, a lot of people are verbal or tactile, or, you know, you have to know the way that you learn things and that you respond to things. But the action plans that we work with people are usually tuned into those kind of things. And we really try to help people build resilience by putting certain things in action. And we've noticed that some of those things, especially like self-care, they're behavioral issues. So it's like with me, it taking 2 years to, you know, get yoga into my routine. It didn't just happen, you know, it took a while. It took, you know, some real concentration in that area to get to that point. So it can happen, and but working with someone on developing action plans is great. And, you know, through all of this, it's really, and that's why I like coaching so much, because it's really about the power is with the coachee, the person that you're helping, and you're empowering or giving them that sense of control. Now, of course, there's the things we can control and the things we can't control. But of the things that we can control, I want them to be able to say, oh, well, okay, you've looked at, you know, these role models. We've looked at the role models that you've had in the past. We've looked at the way that you've built optimism, you've trained, you're involved in these spiritual experiences, and all of that is giving you power over your life to transform it and to transform other people's lives in the process. So it's not just simply about my own transformation, my own building resilience, but it's also helping those that are the vulnerable ones, the ones that are less resilient, those that we can help to bring them through. So that's, I think, where we're going to stop for a moment. Just wanted to ask if there are any questions or comments.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you do have any questions for Glenn, we can do it two ways. You can type your questions into the chat, or if you raise your hand, I can give you speaking privileges and you can ask your question directly. So we'll leave it open for a moment if there's any other remaining questions. And Petra, do you have anything you'd like to add today?
I just want to really say how much what you shared, Glenn, resonated with me as well. And one of the things that I think is paramount is what you touched on with respect to energy management. You know, how do you allocate your own resources appropriately so that you are able to show up, you know, the best possible way for self and then of course for others, right? So I think that's a big thing, particularly because our brain is taking up a lot of that energy, zooming in on that negative or that crisis or that all the things that we're not really comfortable with, and it drains us. And I think there is a piece that just needs to be recognized here. So our resources are somewhat limited until we manage that shift, right? And really control, which is going into what you said about what are we able to control versus the things that are outside our control. We can most definitely learn to control where we spend our energy, right? And what we're thinking around and what we're zooming in on, and if that's supporting us in our effort or rather not. So that really resonated with me. That was awesome. And then the other thing that I really enjoyed hearing about was the whole idea of installing a sense of purpose again, right? That meaning piece, very big. I think sometimes we just feel so overwhelmed, and then it's just like, why am I doing this? There's nothing I can really affect here, when in fact we can, right? We really can. And I think we need to be mindful of how to position that for ourselves, and then also how can we bring this piece forward and support others with that particular approach. So
Glenn, we've got our first question here from Colleen. So I'm going to get her on board here. And Colleen, if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question to Glenn.
Thanks, Michael. Glenn, I was just wondering, what sort of resources would you recommend that we could possibly share with perhaps coaching clients we're dealing with, or other individuals that might need some sort of help?
We do have a resource list of books and papers that the research that went behind this presentation. So if you write to Petra at LeggUP, I think she can send that list to you.
Yep, be glad to make that available. Absolutely.
Yeah. There's a new book that came out about a year or two ago called R is for Resilience. And that's an excellent book. I would really recommend either podcasts or the books by Basil van der Kolk. He wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score. Because, for years I was a, psychotherapist and doing counseling, using cognitive behavior therapy. And a lot of it was, about the mind and the mindset change. And of course, I still do that. And I still think that's vitally important. But guys like Basil van der Kolk and Peter Levine that wrote a book called Walking the Tiger brought to our whole team's mind the idea that we really need to look at the physical body. Of course, all of the dimensions, the spiritual, the social, the physical, emotional, mental, the soul, all of that is important. But I think we academics and counselors, sometimes we miss the physical body part and the breathing and opening up neural pathways and how, all of it is interconnected. It's not just, we don't have different dimensions. Like some joke about academics, they have their body, just to keep their head on their shoulders, to walk around, that type of thing. So yeah, we're all interconnected, and it's so important. So those books were really, there's several articles by Harvard Business Review that I have on the list. One even came out this week that is vitally important, and they interviewed 20 hospital medical administrators of large systems, and they were just saying that they're just really completely overloaded, and that this crisis is nothing they've ever seen before, but also how they're working through it, which I absolutely wanted to read. That's on the resource list as well.
Great, thank you for your question, Colleen. The next question is, how did you prepare to become a resilience coach, and how long have you been practicing?
Well, actually, I've only been a coach for the last, an ICF certified coach for a couple of years. I've been a psychotherapist, clinical social worker for 35 years. My very first job was the coordinator of therapeutic foster care for the state of Maryland after graduate school at the University of Maryland. And I worked in a neighborhood where The Wire was filmed, if you know that neighborhood of West Baltimore. And I noticed there were some twin studies that were done at that time too, studies of twins where they followed them, a longitudinal study, so they followed them for their whole lifespan. And you could see these one went in one direction and didn't thrive as well. Another one went in another direction and really did it much better. So they were really trying to understand what were the specific vulnerabilities and resiliencies of the different of those kids. And that's really how resilience studies, as far as I know, started. Well, maybe before that, with military studies from the Second World War and the whole thing of shell shock, and which became PTSD eventually. That's how I got into it. You know, in terms of coaching, why I went through the ICF was I wanted to get really good skills in terms of the actual technique of coaching. And that's what that did so well for me. In terms of resilience, I had to learn that over 35 years. I mean, I have people that apply for positions on my trauma team that I have with one of the NGOs. And sometimes I just tell them, you know, you need about 10 or 15 more years experience before you work with us, because you need, you know, we work in conflict zones and in disaster areas, and you need to draw upon your own resilience through great difficulties and be able to apply theory to practice for a number of years before you can really, well, it's, you know, of course, that's for a trauma resilience type of therapist, not for a coach. I think for a coach, you certainly can read some of these articles and get a mentor who's a resilience type of coach, or someone like Petras, who is a energy expert type of coach, and or others. I tell you, my mentors are worth their weight in gold. I really go around the world and I seek out people and hound them until they give me a few minutes. And sometimes literally it's only a few minutes or an hour. And what I take from that, what I took from Dr. Thielman coming back from the embassy there was, you know, life-changing. So I think it's just getting around those kind of people who really work on, you know, building resilience in other people and being in, you know, being energized by them.
We have one last question for us, and then I know Petra wants to comment and tell us a little bit about the webinar coming up next week. But the last question is kind of a comment as well. We are so focused on work areas with customers that perhaps we forget our own mindfulness. From your point of view, is that common?
All of us, whether it's nonprofit or the business world. And I think even more with the business, well, I don't know. I think we both have the same issue, just from completely different, you know, environments. But when you are customer focused, and you are, you know, you have a team that, you know, you have goals, customer focused type of goals that you've set for the company, man, and you guys are achieving those goals. Now you have a crisis like what's going on now. You rebuild from it, you get back into it, and the focus can just be completely, you know, on only the customer and not on ourselves or on your team, or being, you know, this is a long distance race. This is a marathon. This is not a sprint. So prepare yourself in that way and you'll do just fine.
Excellent. Petra, can you tell us a little bit about what's coming up next week, date and time, and the topic?
Yes, love to. So we are actually having a very nice follow-up on today's presentation, digging a little bit further into the mind-body connection that you so wonderfully also referenced here, Glenn. Really the idea, you know, in terms of how do we master focus, how do we really bring our thoughts together, and how do we, you know, really come from a place of inner calmness and create that stillness for ourselves and that ability to control, again, where our mind is racing at certain moments, and how do we support our body in that. So our next webinar is Mastering Focus with Millie Mabel. She is also one of our LeggUP coaches and an expert in this particular area. We're very much looking forward to that. And I think it's really a nice follow-up from today's conversation that we had. We will be with you all here for the coming weeks. Every Thursday, we have a couple of other wonderful topics coming up. So we would Look forward to have you guys join us again next week for Mastering Focus. We have True Empowerment coming up, Learning Agility, and Team Mindset. So all topics that pertain to how we can set ourselves up for success while working from home in these very unprecedented circumstances that we're all in today. And with that, I want to thank you again, Glenn, for your very, very valued insight that you were able to share with us here today. It was
Thanks for having me.
wonderful to hear your experiences and what you've been able to observe in the course of your work. I want to thank everybody for joining us here today. We will, as we have gotten several questions regarding recordings, we will make a link available to today's webinar. And we will publish that to everyone that registered here today. So you will see that through your email. And again, thank you for joining today. And we're all looking forward and are excited for you guys to come back and join us next week.